All right. Welcome, class, to another session. And this is one that I'm really excited about. About 4 or 5 years ago when I started teaching this class and started doing my deep dive into my fandom of Disney, and then kind of going out from there and reaching new areas. And when I got to Marvel and I started paying more attention to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is when I came across this book by Reed Tucker, Slugfest: Inside the Epic 50-Year Battle Between Marvel and DC. And as some of you know, my research that I do is on fan behavior, group behavior, and rivalry, and basically why people treat others differently based on their affiliations in their certain groups. And so this book just really spoke to me the first time that I listened to it on Audible. And then fast forward a few years, I'm getting to talk to Reed about it, and we're going to have a conversation on it, and hopefully he'll be able to clear up some things, and we'll just talk about some of the rivalry between the two companies. So first, I want to welcome Reed to the class and the podcast. And Reed, if you would first just give us a brief introduction about how you, or what got you into comics.
Sure. Thanks, Cody. I'm honored to be here. I don't think I have ever spoken to a college class before, so I feel like I'm punching above my weight class on this one. But I guess there won't be grades. But let's see. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so superheroes were kind of everywhere. My brother and I had Underoos. The Incredible Hulk TV show was on, so we kind of knew superheroes were around, but this was also a time where comic books were much more available than they are now. They were at the grocery store and drugstores and convenience stores. So I think I started just reading them randomly as a kid. One came free I remember in a box of honeycomb cereal. So you'd read that. You'd pick them up at the convenience store. So it wasn't until probably I was 12, 13, 14 that I really started it as a hobby, seek them out, follow certain artists and writers, follow certain titles. And it kind of grew from there.
Okay. And you disclose in the book, which is now a few years old. So I say that to say things may have changed a little bit, but you do disclose you really don't have a dog in the fight between Marvel and DC because you're reading more independent books now.
Yeah.
Do you remember what were the first either characters or books that really got you interested in the comic genre, the superhero genre?
Yeah, I can remember exactly. And it was probably like a lot of people, Batman. And so, it's funny because my interest in comics intersected at the time in the 80s where comics were really changing, that they were doing a lot more experimental things. They were getting darker, more mature, more grown up. So, I was at that perfect age to read things like, Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, or Alan Moore's Dave Gibbons' Watchmen, or the Long Bow Hunters, Mike Grell, and things like that, where if comics had never changed and had never kind of become more sophisticated, I'm not sure I would have stuck with them. So that kind of pulled me in much deeper, and it sort of suggested that there was, that had much more potential in comic books than I think society at large thought, even back then. And sometimes now they're thought of as like just kid stuff. And, if you talk about being an adult who reads comic books, people look at you a little cross-eyed. So, I had that good fortune to be around reading comics at that time when,
Okay.
I mean, they were truly getting great. So that Batman I remember, and, Watchmen, those characters probably pulled me in most.
Okay. And before, when you first started talking and you started talking about the prevalence of comics, the availability of comics when you were growing up, it made me think of something. So I want to make sure to ask it before we start talking about the book, and I forget about it. Um, now, comic book stores, there are fewer comic book stores around. And now a lot of the companies and brands have gone to more kind of the digital route. Like if you can be the Marvel Unlimited to read like the Marvel catalog. Um, how important, considering that these comics, in a way, I mean, the whole library, or most of the library, I should say, of these companies are available. But even the comic book stores are fewer and fewer. How important do you think it is for people today to have brick and mortar comic book stores versus like the digital collections that we see today?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting question. And anecdotally, I've seen things change in about the last 10 years, and that um, it's really hard to get stats on how many people are reading comic books in print or especially digitally. So we really don't know, but all the stats I've read said that the number of people who are consuming them digitally is really small, maybe 10% of what the actual print readership is. And as you know, the print readership is also very small. So I think that's a very small slice. But when I go to comic conventions now, it's mostly about collector's items. They've become that. It's less about reading, and that's probably happened. I've seen that shift in about the last 10 years. So
Okay.
people, they put them in these plastic boxes and have them graded, and they trade them almost like currency. You can never open up the box and read them again, or their value is going to go down. So that's really happened. Yeah, I don't know. I personally don't know anyone that has a Marvel Unlimited subscription, but I agree with you. It's really nice that there's this whole library at your fingertips. And if you do go see the Avengers movie and you're interested in, Guardians of the Galaxy or whatever, it's not very far away that you can go back and just see, at your fingertips, the entire history of the characters. Whereas when I was growing up, that was much more difficult because it meant going from comic book store to comic book store, trying to search those individual issues down. Even trade paperbacks didn't really exist that much back in the 80s, until The Dark Knight Returns came along. And so it's a much, much different experience now. So yeah, but it's an interesting question. Is digital the future? I don't really know. Most people tell me that the hardcore collectors want that physical item to collect. That's what sort of soothes their, scratches their itch. Whereas the digital, I don't know how big of a business that is, or if that's sustainable going into the future. I really don't know.
Yeah. Well, and I think that you mentioned so many things there that could just be so many offshoots of like maybe even future visits where we're talking about like kind of the future of comic book stores and conventions and the future of digital. Like I will say, and most people that have taken the class or listened to some of the episodes of the podcast where we've talked about comics and talked about the MCU in particular, I consider myself a new MCU fan. That before we started recording, I shared with Reed that I was really introduced to the superhero genre in the late 80s with Michael Keaton's Batman. And that was kind of my introduction. And then since then, I remember had seen the first Iron Man when it came out. But then I really didn't watch many superhero movies until after Infinity War had come out and Endgame was going to come out. And that's when I really started watching a lot of the MCU and caught up on everything. And now it's such a large part of my kind of daily life and consumption. So being a newer fan, I didn't have the history of a lot of these characters. So I do have a Marvel Unlimited for the purpose of, like, when I knew I was going to go see Shang-Chi, I wanted to go and read kind of one of his latest runs about the character. And like I'm trying to do that with Eternals now and everything. So I have a little bit of a background on it when I go into seeing these projects. But it is really, really interesting. And like I said, it's something we could talk about by itself for a long time. But I do want to talk about Slugfest. It's such a fascinating read. And I love listening to things on Audible. So I pretty much listened to it nonstop when I first listened to it. And then the second listen as well.
Thanks.
That what got you into, or what gave you the idea to write specifically about the Marvel DC relationship?
I guess there were a couple things. At the time I wrote the book, I guess it came out in 2017. I was the movies reporter at the New York Post, so I wrote about movies. I didn't review them, and I can remember there was a moment, 2014 probably, where a Marvel movie and a DC movie were scheduled to come out on the same day. And granted, it was, a year and a half in the future or something like that, but both studios had scheduled their movie for the same day. And the internet kind of exploded of, oh, look at these guys. I can't believe this is happening. And so when that happened, my mind flashed back to sort of when I was a kid. And I can remember, certainly back in the 70s and 80s, kids used to argue about that stuff all the time on the playground, that Marvel's better, no, DC's better, the Hulk could beat up Superman, all these things that kids argue about. Maybe they still do today. So I guess my thought was, if I could remember that as a kid when it was going on then, it's still going on now. There must be some meat to the story. And then my next thought was, that's such an obvious idea that somebody must have done it already, but no one had. So I sat down to write the book.
Well, and it's a book about the relationship about the two companies, or of the two companies, but it's also a great history of Marvel and DC. And obviously you're always writing about kind of, how they're comparing themselves to each other. But it's a really, really good history of the companies. And there's so many kind of cool little tidbits in there. And one, I was not aware that in the early days, DC, or Detective Comics, was, that was the big name.
Yeah.
And it's maybe arguably still has two of the most well-known characters in Batman and Superman. And then, Marvel was the kind of young upstart that was like, sort of bucking all of the trends and everything. And it was a really, really interesting kind of dynamic between the two companies. Can you briefly tell us kind of where it started, and then when Marvel started to take over kind of the market of comics?
Yeah, I also found that fascinating because of the way that Marvel dominates, global mainstream pop culture now, and compared to what they were. It's interesting because, like you said, DC was kind of that blue chip company back then. Both companies were founded in the late 30s. DC in 1938 with Spider-Man. Superman launched kind of a superhero boom, and then there were a lot of companies that tried to ride its coattails with their own superheroes. And so Marvel was one of those. Marvel was just this kind of trashy copycat company that published not just comic books, but a lot of other stuff. Books. They published like these sort of like shady men's magazines. It was not a top tier company, and so it survived. They had Captain America. That was probably their marquee character in the 40s, but it survived through the 40s. It even survived through the 50s when a lot of companies went out of business. But it sort of limped along. At one point, it was basically just one employee at Marvel Comics, and that was Stan Lee, and then he had freelancers. And so it was not it was not by any stretch of imagination a very nice or valued company. Meanwhile, DC was like, the IBM, the blue chip, the Apple of the comic book world. Like you mentioned, they had Superman, they had Batman, they had Wonder Woman. Those three characters have been in continuous publication since they came out in the 30s and 40s. So they were making, money hand over fist. Superman had a radio show, Superman had a cartoon, a TV show, Batman had movie serials. They were much more of a force in pop culture. So it wasn't until the early 60s when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby launched this new line of superheroes that Marvel really started to make inroads. Until then, they were publishing westerns or romance comics or war comics, or mostly titles you probably never heard of. So then in 1961, when they started publishing Fantastic Four, all that changed. Then that Marvel universe was built, and they kind of caught DC by surprise. They were going up while their fortunes were kind of falling. And so I think in 1972, Marvel for the first time passed DC in sales. And so it was like, kind of David beat Goliath in a way, and no one expected it. And that has changed since 1972, except for a couple months here and there. DC has never beat Marvel in sales again. And now it's happening with the movies. It's that same dynamic where DC is kind of getting crushed.
Well, and what's so interesting is one thing that we talk about when we talk about rivalry is there's always the group that sees themselves as like the top group, and then there's always kind of the challenger. And it depends which group you're in, which group you think is the challenger, or the one that should win all of the time. But in the book, you mentioned you write about several stories where the upper management at DC just sort of scoffed or didn't want to pay attention to the fact, or didn't want to listen to the fact that this this Marvel company was starting to become really, really popular. And I think that's really interesting, and it really struck a chord with me because we see that a lot within the rivalry research, is that from consumers and fans' perspective, whatever group they are a member of, there's always a group that's comparable to them, but then a group that is below them that they should always do better than and never do worse than. And it was when I was listening to the book, it almost seemed that was the way that DC viewed Marvel in the early days, at least. And another thing that that I made mention of, or the note of, is in the 90s, before we get there, I think it is important to point out, because you spend a lot of time writing about it also, why did people consume Marvel so much, or why did Marvel stories beginning in the 60s really resonate with readers, it compared to what was going on at DC at the time?
Well, I mean, in a way, they had different markets. DC, their ideal reader was always kids, boys and girls at the time. It's much more boys now, but say between the ages of 7 and 12. That was who they were writing to. That was their top audience. Marvel came along, and I don't know if they planned it necessarily, but they sort of targeted a little bit of an older audience. Their material was a little bit more sophisticated. Their characters were a little more human. I mean, that's the famous thing. They tried to make stories about humans who happen to be superheroes, instead of superheroes who were trying to pretend to be human, like DC was doing. So Stan Lee and Jack Kirby injected a lot of that sort of empathy and humanity into their characters. They were dealing with real world problems, but also the stories were written and drawn in a more sophisticated way than what was going on at DC. Where Lois Lane was trying to trick Superman into marrying her for the 300th time or whatever. Meanwhile, Marvel's putting out comics about, racial protests and
Mhm.
war and crazy science gods that live in Asgard and stuff like that. And, Doctor Strange acid trips and, whatever they were doing. So it was a much more sophisticated audience that roped in high schoolers and college students and then some adults as well.
Yeah. And because Marvel was based in kind of our real world setting for a lot of the heroes were, or a lot of the characters, it did, it is more, or it made it easier to kind of see yourself in those characters. And I'm sure, many people know the story of, or at least how the story is told of, Stan Lee wanting to walk away and then writing the Fantastic Four because he wanted to be a novelist. And so that's kind of his last opportunity to, or his last chance at the kind of encouragement of his wife to just write what you want to write. And that was what was the Fantastic Four. And with the drama and the bickering amongst characters and the kind of real world issues that people deal with, that I think is really, really interesting. One, in the book, you talk about crossovers.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that, like, as of now, still JLA Avengers is the last crossover. But one thing that I found really interesting, just kind of a fun trivia point, was what was the first crossover between Marvel and DC?
Oh, it was it was a Wizard of Oz adaptation in the 70s. A Treasury edition, so it's like a big comic book that they published. Um, it was just sort of a legalese kind of thing. They didn't really collaborate as much as they sort of shared a license, is my understanding. And so that was the first comic book that actually had both of their names, sort of in small print on the inside of the comic.
Yeah, and at that time, right around that time, there were also a bunch of, um, I forget how you termed it in the book, but I'll call them secret collaborations or secret crossovers.
Yeah.
And that was all done by artists at both companies because the artists really enjoyed kind of, I mean, they were fans and they had the arguments of who would win in this matchup. And so they tried these secret collaborations or secret crossovers to do that. What are some of the examples of that stuck out to you?
Yeah, those are good examples. Yeah, like you mentioned, they were fans, so they tried to, they were all friends too. All the artists and writers who worked at the different companies, so they would hang around and they would go to a party and have a few beers or whatever, and then they would just sort of dare each other to, hey, why don't we do this? And so there was one, a very famous one where some of the characters visited a Halloween party in Vermont, in Rutland, which they have a famous giant Halloween celebration. And so some of the writers and some at Marvel and some of the writers at DC were both friends. They would go up there every year, and so they decided to write one single storyline that sort of wove through some of the books between Marvel and DC, unbeknownst to the management or the
Mhm.
editors at either company. They sort of did it, like you said, on the sly. So if you were just reading DC books at the time or just reading Marvel books at the time, you might not have noticed anything was out of the ordinary. But if you read all of those books and then you started to see how the story kind of slyly continued through these different ones, then that was kind of a little wink to you as a fan that we're doing this little inside thing here. So there were a lot of those, secret appearances by characters and secret crossovers and things where, like, the sort of doppelgangers of the Avengers would show up
Mhm.
in the Justice League book, and vice versa. And so that's how they had to do it for a while because there weren't any official crossovers.
Yeah. And some of the stories about, like, how just sort of I guess the legal maneuvers or management maneuvers during the official crossovers, about, how's revenue sharing and whose name is listed first, and who is going to match up against whom. And like, I remember you writing about Superman and the Amazing Spider-Man, and
Yeah.
the fact that, yeah, if in this fantastical world of comic book and superhero characters, if they actually did meet and fight, how kind of successful really would a Peter Parker be against, someone not from this
Right.
earth? And
Right.
kind of the fun ways that they sort of worked around things like that. And one that really stuck out, and I can't remember what crossover it was. I believe it was in either the late 80s or early 90s, that they actually had a fan vote. There were
Oh yeah.
13 issues.
Yeah.
And so I think you said 6 of the matchups ended in kind of ties or draws, but then the 6 others, and then I guess the 7th,
Yeah.
it was actually left up to a fan vote. Can you tell a little bit about that one? Because that one's fascinating.
Yeah, and the thing about those crossovers is they usually come at a time where the industry is really kind of floundering, and so that was in the mid '90s where comic book sales had kind of fallen off a cliff, and so both the companies then are willing to work together to try to pull the industry out of the doldrums, and so that was one of those that was such a big event that it actually brought some people back into comic book stores. But it was called, I think, DC versus Marvel. 2 issues, and then 2 issues were called Marvel versus DC, and it was just that ultimate kind of fan fiction of what would happen if Superman fought Thor. All those things I was just talking about we used to argue about as kids. So they set up all those matchups, Lobo versus Wolverine, and all these things that the fans have been clamoring to see for years, who would win. And you're right, they had a fan vote on some of them, and so the artist actually had to draw 2 separate pages for the end of the fight, who would win with Wolverine. And then when the fan vote came in, they would slot in the 1 page showing the winner. And, if you read them now, those things are never very good because, I talked to some of the artists and the writers behind them, and there's just, as you were saying earlier, there's so many constraints on them
Yeah.
about what they can and can't do. No one can actually hurt one another. There can't be any changes to the status quo. No one can get humiliated. No one can, one of the stipulations of that was the fan vote would determine which company won, the most characters that won. And one of the stipulations was that company that won was not allowed to advertise the fact that it won. So when Marvel eventually won, they weren't allowed to run an ad saying, we're better than DC, we did this. So, I mean, it's just fan service that's kind of, not a very good story, but I guess sort of makes some headlines at the time.
Yeah. Well, and I remember you writing that it wasn't an ad, but in one of their books, Marvel did mention
They did.
that, they were victorious. I don't
That's
know if
right.
they said the word win or not. And then
Right.
because of the agreement, they had to take that out.
That's right. Yeah,
And
it was.
scrap all of that.
That's right. You're right. It was something more subtle. I don't know. I think they tried to use legalese like this is not an ad. This is more of an in-house promo, yeah, or something like that. But yeah, you're right. They did. They couldn't help but crow about it, and then DC got its feathers ruffled and said,
Yeah.
you can't do that.
So if you jump forward to today, the rivalry is different because as you write about, you write about now, it's more of a corporate rivalry.
Yeah.
It's which when we talk about corporate rivalries, I always think of Marvel, DC, Disney, Universal, and the theme parks, these different entertainment companies, or Samsung, Apple, that really, because there's the competition between the 2 companies and the brands, it really benefits the fans and the consumers. Like if you're a theme park fan and you like going to Disney and you like the new rides at Rise of the Resistance and Galaxy's Edge, or so, you're probably going to like the Wizarding World of Harry Potter because a lot of the people have worked on multiple projects, but also as one company kind of ups the game, the other one has to catch up, and then they up the game. Because we are because the rivalry exists at the corporate level now, and for most consumers, the general consumers at least, um, it exists in the theaters. Do you first, the first question is, how do you see kind of that rivalry now between Marvel and DC when we look at the theatrical releases and the performance at the box office and things like that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It makes me kind of miss the old days of the rivalry where, before Disney bought Marvel, and they were both. I mean, Disney was bought by sort of a giant media company, but it was still more of a mom and pop
Mhm.
rivalry, and there was crossover among the talent, and there was that sort of friendly rivalry. I guess it got ugly at times, but now it feels like it sort of doesn't even exist to me, I guess, anymore. And I don't, just because it's not down on the ground anymore, there's
Mhm.
not that, they're not trading punches. But I agree with you what you said about the one-upsmanship. I think there's still a little bit of that there, but I mean, for me, DC is so far behind that Marvel, I don't even think thinks of them that much. I think I interviewed Kevin Feige once and I asked him about that, and he was like, they all say the same thing, which is success of any superhero movie is good for us because that's
Mhm.
what we're trying to build up. He would never say, well, we want DC to fail. So, I don't know. It's interesting because there's one company will always be up and the other company kind of down, and then that changes over the years. So it just kind of ebbs and flows, I guess. And yeah, I don't know. I personally don't know too many people who are diehard fans of one company like they were back in this 70s and 80s that they will only see Marvel movies. Maybe that's true just because I personally think that the Marvel product is better than DC, but I don't think if you like superhero movies, you're a Marvel fan. DC puts out a good one, you won't go see it just because you're trying to boycott DC. I don't think that pettiness is there with the films as much as it was with the comic books and superhero world back in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
Um, I wish it would come back. Let's get some pettiness in this thing.
Well, and it's interesting in that when it is, because it is so corporate now, and you mentioned it feels very separate almost,
Yeah,
that each company now, they obviously get compared. And there's actually, I made a few notes in here about like people being asked, the talent, the actors and actresses being
yeah,
asked about working for Marvel or working for DC. And it, reading or listening to the book, what struck me is like, if you are someone who is in a MCU movie, obviously you're going to say that's better because, well, that's where your income's coming from. That's
yep,
where your creative passion is, or that's where your creative efforts are going. Um, and I wondered if there's any type of agreement that, like, if you ask somebody who is in an MCU movie, is it actually, is it in a contract that they have to say great things about the MCU and maybe not horrible things about DC, but they're not going to laud DC and vice versa. And then there are some examples you write about in the book where people have actually gotten downright, they started
yeah.
cursing and everything about
It's
the other company.
That's right. It makes headlines when somebody says something nasty about it. I don't know. I know most of the people who star in those movies do have some sort of non-disparagement agreement in their
Mhm.
contract, where they're not allowed to talk ill about their own project or people they work with or the movie. I don't know if it includes the competition. I've never heard of that, but they generally have to, as you say, speak nicely about
Yeah.
about the films that they're in. So, but yeah, it makes headlines when somebody lets loose with a little bit of honesty.
Yeah. And there, when I was listening to that part of the book, I started making notes. I said, there are people, what about the people who've worked for both? And I quickly jotted down three names, and I'm sure there are so many more. But like Ryan Reynolds has been in both a DC and
Mhm.
Marvel movie. Zachary Levi, even though he was more of a supporting character in Thor: The Dark World, and then Michael Keaton, the kind of a lot of people, myself included, their introduction to superhero movies, and then jump forward to Spider-Man Homecoming, and he's playing the villain in it, and he's supposed to be playing in other Marvel movies. Do you know um do you have a sense of how many people, or how many actors and actresses have been in projects for Marvel and DC?
That's a good question. I think generally there's not that much crossover, because I think once they become associated with that one universe or one role, then the other one doesn't want them, quite honestly. The one exception I can think of is when Marvel has success and then DC tries to poach at, as what happened with Joss Whedon,
Mhm.
for better or worse, I guess we know at this point. But he had the success with the Avengers, and so DC is floundering with their superhero universe. So they want to bring a little bit of that Marvel magic over, and so they hire him, to rework the Justice League. But yeah, I can't think of too many actors that have been in both. I think
Yeah.
for that reason, not because their contracts were vetted or whatever, but just because I think they're associated with being over there, and
Yeah.
it would take fans out of the experience when they're watching and being like, oh, is that Shazam on the screen or whatever?
Yeah. Well, and the also, I'm not sure the contracts with DC, but people's contracts with Marvel and in the MCU, I mean, it takes up a lot of a person's time and
Yeah.
effort that when they sign on for something like that. Something real quick that you talked about that I thought was really interesting is like um, the introduction of Crisis Crisis on Infinite Earths for DC and Secret Wars for Marvel, and kind of like the background reason why DC really wrote or started producing the Crisis on Infinite Earths was for continuity reasons.
Yeah.
I thought that was a really interesting story. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then also the reason why Marvel wrote Secret Wars, and kind of because that had to do with, both of those had to do with the competition.
Yeah, in a way, exactly. Yeah, it's interesting. That's sort of one of the big differences between the universes, I think, is that Marvel, because it started in the 60s and has been carried on to this day with, Stan Lee oversaw a good chunk of it. It's had that continuity of storytelling. So, I mean, they claim that they've been telling a single story since 1961. So those issues that are happening now are happening in the same timeline and universe that were happening back in 1961. So, Reed Richards from the Fantastic Four, the things that you've read, they've all happened to him.
Mhm.
So things are still happening to him. Whereas DC, they never had necessarily as much continuity as Marvel did. They often had one-off issues. The story didn't carry over. Things that happened in the last issue didn't carry over. Superman lost his powers or this or that. But when comic books started to become more collectible, I guess, and fans started to become more hardcore about it in the 60s, that started to sort of bend their nose out of shape about DC. And there's one particular instance in the late 70s with one issue, I think Green Lantern, where this character called Adam Strange didn't recognize another
Mhm.
character that he had met and seen in another issue, not even of Green Lantern, but in another DC comic, several years earlier. And so the fans were like, well, what's going on? How come he didn't recognize this person? And so the writer and editor, at DC started to, it bothered them too, because they were fans. And so they started to try to formulate a way to smash all this kind of, discombobulated continuity into one single timeline so they could have what Marvel had.
Mhm.
That was one of the huge advantages that Marvel had, was every story mattered because the story kept going and going and going. And so people, would collect all the Marvel comics because they needed to have the whole
Mhm.
universal story. So DC did that with Crisis on Infinite Earths. They basically destroyed all the parallel Earths and tried to create one seamless timeline to wipe out all those continuity errors that they had made earlier, really to please the hardcore fans. Um, and in terms of Secret Wars, I mean, it was just a money grab.
Yeah.
Marvel, they had people come to them to try to make toys off of their characters. And so, I mean, that's what happened. A toy company came to them and said, hey, we want to make these toys. Can you make a comic book miniseries around it? And they said, okay, sure, we'll do that. And then as it turned out, it was a giant hit and like one of the first event series in comics. And so, but again, as you were saying, one does something and then the other one has to one up them. They just keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And so that was kind of an early example of what was going on there.
Well, and with Secret Wars, I believe the company was Mattel that was asking them for the toys, but Mattel asked Marvel for a toy or for stories around a toy line, because didn't Mattel first they had lost out on a bid for DC toys.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. So they were interested in superhero toys, but they were just taking whatever they could get. And that Secret Wars was sort of a byproduct of this toy license, and it was really made to sell toys. That's in part why Spider-Man got that black costume, was because they needed a new toy to sell. Kids already owned Spider-Man toys. They needed to have a new Spider-Man toy to sell to them. So I mean, it was really just sort of a cash grab.
Yeah. Well, and the another thing kind of off of that I find really interesting is that, just as we talked about, there's so many things that one company would do that the other company would then try to like catch up or play one-upsmanship. And one thing that I want to point out before we kind of shift to talking about another topic is in the 90s, when around distribution, you tell a story about, let me make sure, you tell a story where Marvel purchases Heroes World to be the distribution, their distributor. DC goes with Diamond Distributor and actually has an option to purchase Diamond after 10 years. Or I should say after the Diamond founders pass away, 10 years after that. And those two companies kind of going different paths really kind of broke up the distribution of so many different comic book companies, and really put a lot of comic book companies and distributors out of business. And then later, you tell this fascinating story about when Heroes World closes shop, Marvel had to essentially go with Diamond. And you tell this really cool story about that if that agreement's still in effect today, that DC could buy Diamond, DC would effectively kind of control the distribution of Marvel again, which is something they did back in the 50s and 60s, which is kind of what led to, because Marvel or DC put so many constraints on Marvel, that's really what led to Marvel being able to build this like kind of connected universe, because they couldn't put out a lot of content.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's weird to think of that. I'm not sure. I think that option may have expired now for DC, but yeah, I mean, it's a funny thing to think about. Back in the 50s, Marvel had a distributor, that was basically responsible for sending its comics to newsstands, and it went belly up. And the only distributor that would take them at the time was Independent News, which was owned by DC. And so, as you mentioned, you have that weird situation where your competitor is controlling your output. And so DC, they didn't want the competition. So they said, Marvel, you can only produce 8 titles a month. And like you said, that was tough in one hand, and that they could only release a certain number of titles and make a certain amount of money, but it allowed one person, Stan Lee, to control all the titles. So he was able to build that universe among all those titles. And so that's one of the reasons why the Marvel universe was born, was because of the sort of the limits put on by the DC as Marvel's distributor. But yeah, I mean, it must go against some laws now. I can't think of another situation where somebody's competitor
Yeah.
controls their distribution. Maybe, yeah, I mean, I can't imagine.
Yeah, I mean, and then even like one just really cool quick story of the from the book is like the cliffhanger, the notion of the cliffhanger in
Yeah.
individual books really came from the fact that Stan, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, DC was still controlling Marvel's distribution at that time, but they had kind of increased the distribution.
Mhm.
And really, Marvel got so thinly stretched that Stan Lee had the idea to tell stories, maybe tell one story over 3 or 4 different books,
Yeah.
not just kind of wrap it up in one book like was the traditional sense. So, again, it's like that competition and trying to control what the competitor can do really led to the innovation of what I know as in my comic book fandom, and I'm not, as I said, I'm a newer Marvel fan. I didn't grow up much on comics, but that's what I know is like that cliffhanger notion from
Yeah,
book to book, and that's what gets you to read the next book. Like stories like that
for
are
sure.
really, really, really
Yeah.
cool that you
Yeah.
have in here.
And thanks. It's a weird, you're right. That's a sort of a good point, is that it grew out of sort of a business relationship, and it grew out of necessity because Stan Lee was working too hard over too many titles. But I mean, like you see it now, the post credits scene in Marvel, it's that thing that brings you back, coming back for the next film,
Yeah.
leaving you hanging.
Yeah.
Crazy.
And so when we talk about the movies, and to get back to that, and you talk about some of the struggles of superhero movies. I will mention, because I remember watching it as a kid. You wrote about it in the book, Howard the Duck.
Oh,
Some
you
of the
watched it
struggles. I was I was one of the few people that watched it multiple times.
in the
We owned
theater?
that movie when I was growing up.
Oh,
Um,
fair enough.
that, but like some of the struggles of the early superhero movies, and then you write the first comic movie that really made a lot of money was Men in Black,
Yeah.
and was the one that kind of opened people's eyes to, hey, maybe this can work, and eventually led to, like, X-Men and the first Spider-Man trilogy and everything. It was really, really interesting. Like, kind of, do you have any? Was there any, or were there any interesting stories about sort of the introduction or the trial and error of superhero movies that stood out to you?
Hmm. Not really, but just how just how far it's come. If you look back, um, Stan Lee left Marvel, New York Marvel, in the early '70s to move out to Hollywood to focus exclusively on trying to get these Marvel characters set up in films and TV. And he believed in it, but I don't think anyone else did. They sort
Mhm.
of slammed doors in his face and told him, like, what are we gonna, this is kid stuff. What are we gonna do? And so if you look back at the time, some of those deals that they were trying to make, I mean, they would take anything.
Mhm.
There was supposed to be a Silver Surfer movie that was going to be a musical that was with Olivia Newton-John in it. It never got made, but those were the kinds of things that Marvel was exploring back then. There was there were all kinds of just like trashy stuff that they would try to do, because that was really all that they had that was offered to them.
Mhm.
They couldn't make these big budget, decent films, in part because the technology didn't exist to do the special effects, but also because nobody was interested. And so it's amazing how far it's come just in 2 or 3 decades. So I find that fascinating. I don't know if you ever read this magazine called Comic Scene. It was this fanzine in the '80s, but they used to publish, the very last page was comic book films and TVs in, sort of in production. And
Okay.
I look back at those now because I've got them out in my garage, and it's like a Thor movie's coming in the early 80s, or Jim Cameron's
Yeah.
making Spider-Man, or all these things you heard about for years. But then, I look at them now and like basically none of those ever came out. But as a kid, you would read that and you would think, oh, this Spider-Man movie's coming any day now, or this Silver Surfer movie, or whatever. So there were always irons in the fire, but nothing ever came to fruition until Hollywood saw that it was actually working, because
Yeah.
they're afraid to invest their money until somebody can show them, okay, this works. And then everyone jumps on the bandwagon. And so Men in Black in part did that, but I think X-Men as well sort of helped get that ball rolling.
Yeah. Well, and it's, on the Marvel side, the fact that they made so many deals, and yeah, now, people say, oh, why did they let go of their property and everything? Well, people, like you said, it was not what it is now back when they were making all of these deals. So it's completely understandable that they would do
Yeah.
that. And I think it also on the Marvel side has somewhat led to a lot of kind of excitement and speculation that, like, when Disney bought Fox, like, hey, now the X-Men can come into the picture, and Fantastic Four. And I remember, uh Scarlet, or Wanda Maximoff, isn't referred to as Scarlet Witch until episode 8 of the
Right.
Disney Plus series WandaVision. And that fit with the storyline, but it's also, they actually couldn't refer to her as Scarlet Witch before, when Fox owned the naming rights to the character, they could have her in their movies. But and things like that I find really, really interesting. And also, I remember watching the previews and reading stories when Black Widow was going to come out, about, hey, this could be the first instance where a mutant is like kind of introduced into
Yeah.
the MCU. And then I can't remember the name of the character, but he actually is in, he's the one that the Red Guardian arm wrestles in prison.
Yeah.
Was like could be, or maybe is, like the first kind of official mutant that they just didn't
Right.
mention.
Yeah,
I think it adds to kind of the excitement around all of this as well.
definitely. Yeah,
Um,
definitely. Somebody, I think for the book, I think I talked to a lawyer about that, and the X-Men contract apparently gave away too much, that it
mhm,
wasn't worded very specifically. And so they kind of gave away the X-Men and all associated characters. There was very inexact language in the contract. And so people weren't quite sure what that meant. And so they didn't want to go to court to battle about like which character was which. So that's why you kind of see some of these characters that cross over into both. It's like, well, it's Quicksilver. Is he part of the X-Men universe, or is he part of the Fantastic Four? Like
yeah,
which studio owns him, which studio controls him? So there was a lot of trouble, I think, caused by that original X-Men contract that, like you mentioned, is still, sort of was a problem until a few years ago.
yeah. And real quick before I move on to something else, I
Sure.
would be amiss if I didn't mention animation for both of the companies. Both of the companies have experienced a lot of success, and not just animation, but also with like the live action television, especially DC.
Yeah.
I think their live action television series um, seemingly have done very, very well, for the company and for fans. Um, I did want to. There's one thing that when we were communicating originally, and I'm going to try to share my screen so you can see it, because
Mhm.
when we talk about the relationship between fans and Marvel and DC, um, we had, I told you we had actually done experiments comparing,
Oh,
um,
yes.
or studies comparing how comic book fans felt toward either DC or Marvel, compared to how sport fans felt, toward their rival teams. And here are the 9 different settings that we've done these comparisons in. And it started out with, they're all like comics was compared to sport, science fiction compared to sport, theme parks compared to sport. And it's not a surprise that when you're comparing with the sports setting where rivalries get a lot of attention and they're on the national stage, international stage sometimes, that, a lot of the time sport ranks pretty high in comparison to kind of outgroup negativity with the rest. But we also did something else that I thought was really interesting. We compared all 9 settings for the latest book that we wrote. We compared all 9 settings, and we looked at where outgroup negativity is the most negative to the least negative. And so what you see right now is that's the hierarchy, our hierarchy of outgroup derogation. And you see comics is actually the lowest as far as outgroup negativity in the hierarchy. And so you can see, kind of have some mean scores on it. Here's the spectrum, where like more negative is over here, like the online gaming, which is people who either participate in gaming using an Xbox or PlayStation or a like PC. And then politics is a few points lower than that. Sport, a few points lower than both of those. And then, comics is actually one of the 2, and really we could probably say 3 or 4, but it's one of the 2 settings that the mean score actually indicates there's more positivity toward the rival brand than negativity. So I wanted to kind of get your perspective on this. Like, does this, in your research and in your work and just kind of looking at different and thinking about different settings, like, does this make sense to you or how do you make sense of it that comics, which most of the stories are about people in combat with each other, but when you're talking about DC and Marvel, there's actually more positivity in that setting than there are these other settings. Like, how do you make sense of something like that?
That's really interesting. I to me that sort of stands up with what I see out in the world, in part because I think comic book fans are such a small kind of niche group. I always used to wonder, like, comic books is a small sort of niche group of entertainment, and then superhero comics is even a smaller group of a niche group. So it's like, to me, it always seemed really weird that you would, read one, sort of be a fan of one part of those superhero comic books, but then reject the other when you're already existing in that really, really small universe. So it's like, if you're a fan of that thing, to me, it makes sense that you're a fan of that thing, whoever is putting it out. But, I will say that one thing I've also noticed about comic book fans is that, it's made up of a lot of like marginalized people, I feel like, people who feel like they don't fit in well, sort of like the science fiction fans you have here. And they find kind of their home among, their tribe among those comic book fans. I certainly see that when I go to comic book conventions. I just went to the New York Comic Con a couple of weeks ago. And, to me, it's a very accepting, kind of loving environment. That's really what it's become now. They're completely, anti-toxicity. They're very, inclusive to everyone. There's a lot of like, LGBT people there. There's, disabled people there. There's people who are like a little bit, maybe socially awkward. And I think they find their tribe among those people, and everyone is accepted kind of in that comic book world, which, I find kind of nice. So I think that's what's going on, because it's sort of shrunk into that subculture, whereas back in the 70s and 80s, it was much more mainstream because a much larger percentage of the population read comic books, whereas now it's really shrunk down to, a couple 100,000 people, if that.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that. I wanted to share it with you because I had mentioned it to you.
That's cool.
But also I wanted to get your thoughts on it. And that was, it's a really interesting take. And one of the things that we sort of wrote about in our original article of it is, look, if you are a fan of comics, you know, you might have your in group of Marvel or DC, but you also have your in group of a comic fan, and non-comic fans are the out group. So you're kind of, you know, forming
That's
around,
right.
coalescing around that as well.
Yeah.
And mentioning the uh, kind of collective nature now, and again, getting back to, you again mentioned how much more mainstream comic book reading was in the 70s and 80s, and how it's more maybe niche now, because now superhero, it's the big screen or on television, or, you know, Disney Plus or streaming and things like that. um do you think, and also, you know, because the rivalry is so corporate now, which means maybe it's separated and maybe it's less of a rivalry, I don't know, because you're dealing with, you know, corporate companies that have their own relationships and rivalries. Do you think we'll ever see another crossover in the comic book realm, not in movies but in comic books? Okay,
No,
why not?
no. Um, I, no, because it's less run by fans, the companies now, and it's more run by corporate interests. And somebody explained to me was like, the companies are never going to be on equal enough footing where they want to cross over
Yeah.
and go through all those legal headaches. And so, you'd ask Marvel, let's talk about, the movies, like, why can't the Avengers fight the Justice League? And Marvel's answer would be, well, our movies are the biggest in the world. Why are we helping them?
Hmm.
Why do we want to bring them in and make them money and then split up money that we should have with them? So there's sort of that going on. And I think with the comics, it's just, unless the industry absolutely crashes and both companies absolutely crash, which I guess I mentioned earlier is what usually happens to facilitate one of those crossovers. I just don't think you're going to see it again. I mean, these, I hate using IP, but I mean, that's what they are now, is
Hmm.
like IP, and it's just too valuable to share with your main rival. So
Yeah.
I don't think you're ever going to see it again.
Do you, peeking into the future, what do you see as the future of comic or comic book or superhero content and superhero movies? Like, how long do you see this lasting? Do you see it, mm, you know, withering at some point, or decreasing at some point?
Man, I've been wrong on this so many times before. I mean, I can remember working at the newspaper and writing about, like, this has to be the last one, right? No one can possibly take any more of this, but it's still going. I don't know. Yeah, I think Marvel has been really smart about giving us a little different flavor with each one of their movies. It's not the same thing. And so, Black Widow was very different from Doctor Strange, which was very different from, the Hulk or Iron Man or whatever. So I think people haven't gotten tired of them in that way. But man, I really don't know. For me, and I consider myself a fan, it's gotten to be too much. Um, I think they're diluting the brand a lot. It feels a lot less special to me. There's probably, I'm 2 Marvel series behind. I don't think I've watched any of What If. I didn't watch The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. So it's, to me, instead of like something I put on my calendar and go out to see opening
Hmm.
night, like one of their films, 5 or 10 years ago, it's just something that's become almost like Star Wars. It's just like merch first, and then it's just something buzzing in the back of my mind, and it
Okay.
feels, it's cheapened a little bit for me personally. But
Okay.
obviously the box office tallies don't agree with me. But I really don't know. I think Marvel has shown something I also didn't think that they could do, which was take the C or D list character and then make it interesting enough for mainstream audiences across the
Yeah.
world to go plunk their money down. So if they can do that, I feel like it can just go on basically for a really long time.
Well,
The
and
Yeah,
from, like, from what I've seen in talking to people, if the storytelling, as long as the storytelling is good, and it's not just, you write about in the book, it's not just the typical movie or superhero movie. Like, if there's something else there, like in WandaVision, dealing with grief, and the 7 stages of, or 5 stages of grief and things like that, PTSD, and what people are having to deal with. And they're really, really good stories. And so it seems like as long as that is there, um, they're doing well until that starts to falter.
Yeah.
At least I'm talking about the MCU in this case.
Yeah.
So the last thing that I like to do with people, and we have a few minutes left, is I just like to throw out a few rapid questions.
Okay.
And that's something that you can expand on if you want. You don't have to expand on at all. What is your, and for these, because we're talking about Marvel and DC, you don't have to limit to Marvel. You don't have to limit to Marvel and DC if I know you're reading more independent now. Do you have a favorite character, a favorite comic character?
Batman.
Batman. Okay.
Yeah.
And then do you have a favorite story? And by that I mean it could be like a favorite run or a favorite issue, or just a favorite overarching arc, like a character arc through all of their appearances.
Hmm. No, not to repeat myself, but probably The Dark Knight Returns. I just
Okay.
think it still holds up. I thought it was just so revolutionary at the time. I still flip through it every once in a while. It still feels fresh to me and interesting. So I'll go with that.
Okay. So this next one would be this is the one question that's specific to Marvel or the MCU. In the class, we actually, because the MCU characters and Marvel characters are so easy to relate to, and that's what makes them so popular, is that people could see themselves in those characters or see characteristics that they want from those characters. In the class, we actually do an exercise and an assignment where the students read something that I've written about how MCU characters can be used to kind of give meaning to your presence, or and then they talk about what character they see themselves as, or what character they would like to emulate in certain ways. Is there a character in the MCU that you think best personifies you, or that you would like to kind of have their characteristics?
Wow, that's a good question. I don't know why, but Daredevil was the first thing that came to
Okay.
mind. Although I'm nothing like Daredevil, I don't have a law degree. I do live in New York City. I have that. I'm not blind. Um, I don't know. He always felt sort of the most human to me. I always
Okay.
related to him the most growing up. He always, I think he has a decency that people kind of are drawn to. And I certainly haven't had as hard of a life as Matt Murdock has had, but I think there's something really nice and human and down to earth about him that I
Okay.
like.
And then the last one, I know you said there we won't see a crossover in comic book form or movie form, at least now, for presumably for a while, maybe. If we did, what crossover would you most like to see between DC and Marvel?
Oh man, I mean, this would never work, but I mean, everyone, I think the answer has to be the Avengers versus the Justice League. But to me, the tone of those two universes is just so different that I don't know how they would ever blend that or even come up with a story. But just seeing that in the marquee, I think would be the coolest thing. And just that title alone, you've earned $1 billion. The movie could be just just a black screen for 2.5 hours and you'd still earn $1 billion just for that title. But to me, that would be the ultimate kind of fanboy dream project. But as things stand now, I don't think it's ever going to happen. I don't think it's viable at all. But
Okay.
I'd like to see it one day.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Reed, for doing this. Like I said, this
Thank you,
could go
Gary.
on for hours and hours, and maybe we'll talk in the future about how the future
Anytime.
of comic book stores and things. But
Sure.
for anyone who wants to follow you or keep up with what you're doing, what's the best way for them to do that?
I'm on Twitter. It's Reed_Tucker, and should mention the Russo brothers are making a TV series out of my book, which comes out sometime this year, maybe next year. I'm not sure exactly, but they bought the book and they've adapted it into a documentary series.
Of Slugfest?
Yeah, Slugfest.
Oh, well, congratulations.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's
And
cool.
second, congratulations to all of us, because that's going to be awesome to see the
Man,
story.
I don't know. No, it's cool. It's really good. They made it for Quibi. Do you remember that business?
Yeah.
It went out of business. They made it for Quibi. They made 10 episodes. Quibi went under because Quibi was a terrible idea. Roku TV bought it.
Okay.
And so I don't really know when it's coming out, but I've seen the 10 episodes. And if you're into the Rivalry, if you're into comic books or superheroes, it's really well done.
Okay.
The directors are great. Everyone behind it, I don't have that much to do with it, but it's really good. It's a documentary series, but they recreate some of the stuff from comic book history using actors well known from comic book roles.
Yeah.
So they have, Brandon Routh, who played Superman. He'll play, Joe Simon, the co-creator of Captain America. So they have little like Easter eggs like that throughout that I think is pretty cool. So that's something to look forward. I don't know. maybe this year, maybe next year. No one said, but it's coming.
Well, very, very cool. That might
Thanks.
be required viewing in the future for our students. So
it's fun, and each episode's only 10 minutes because it was made for Quibi, so it's not much of a time investment. So you can watch them all in one class.
Well, awesome. And again, thank you so much, Reed, for doing this. And I'm sure I will reach out to you again with other questions about all things comics. So
and vice
thank you
versa.
so much.
If I write another book, I want some of your research on Rivalry. I wish I knew it existed. I could have, you could have had a chapter.
Oh, well, thank you. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks a lot, Cody. See ya.
Bye.